Hey everyone, and thanks for joining me as I close out 2023 with another Q&A session. For the past month, I've been asking you guys what sorts of things you'd like to hear me talk about unscripted, and you sent in your questions and prompts both on my community tab here and on my blog. I've got a handful of good responses there that I'm going to get into and talk about in depth. And while that's going on, I'm going to have in the background some kind of video footage that relates to what I happen to be talking about, whether that's me playing through one of the games that I'm discussing or some other kind of footage. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's jump right into the first question. What are your thoughts on Fire Emblem difficulties? It seems that maddening mode in 3 houses and engage is just too easy. Everyone could do it with ease even without New Game Plus. Should there be another mode higher like Conquest Lunatic or Maddening Plus in future games for players who seek an absurd challenge? I will say right off that my perspective on Fire Emblem difficulties is going to be fairly different from what you'd hear from basically any other FE-tuber that I'm aware of, because I don't actually play Fire Emblem on the higher difficulties. I almost exclusively play it on normal mode or its equivalent, because that's just what I'm most comfortable with, and that's kind of part of like why I play Fire Emblem is not so much because I want something really difficult, but because I just want to enjoy the story and the characters and things like that, and have a bit of a strategic gameplay challenge, and, just enjoy the RPG aspects as well. And it's harder to do that on the higher difficulties. I find they constrain you more. And if I do have any hot take on FE difficulty, it's probably something like that I think that to whatever limited extent Fire Emblem's difficulty is ever balanced, it's more balanced around normal mode or the lower difficulties, because the things I hear, and from my limited experience of actually playing them, of the higher difficulties, it tends to be a lot of blatantly unbalanced stuff, like either the enemies just get massively inflated stats, or they get skills that you have no way of accessing, or there's just some kind of cheese like that, like Radiant Dawn hard mode infamously removes the weapon triangle and your ability to see unit attack ranges. It just seems like Intelligent Systems mostly creates hard mode by beefing up the AI and making it feel more unfair and stacked against the player, as opposed to actually making the game smarter and requiring more tactical knowledge from you. And that's one of the reasons I just don't like the higher difficulties, is that you're limited in the options that you have available to you. And I know too that there's also the sort of question of older Fire Emblem difficulty versus newer Fire Emblem difficulty, whereas in, for example, the Kaga games, there are no proper difficulty modes. But those games are more designed around the idea that you would just let units die, like the Iron Man concept, and you would replace them. But with as character-driven as a franchise as Fire Emblem is, and especially has become in the last decade, that's no longer viable, really. So you don't really see that outside of the Kaga 5, except the DS remakes, of course, because they were very faithful, and to an extent, Binding Blade. So I don't really have a very strong opinion on a difficulty that is higher than Maddening, because, again, from what I've heard about Conquest Lunatic or Awakening Lunatic Plus especially, it's not that enjoyable, even for the people who play on that level, because there are very specific things that you need to do in order to even get past the early game in a lot of cases, and that just doesn't sound fun to me. It's like kind of a thing that you can flex on, or if you're making video content, or if, you make a self-imposed challenge, you can only use so many units, or using the worst classes or whatever, something like that. But you'll notice that even though I cover Fire Emblem a lot, I never do things like that, because I just don't enjoy the game that way, and I don't think forcing myself to play it that way would be a fun time for me, and certainly doing it while recording and showing off for everyone, because I'm not a tactical genius, I fully admit to that. But to try to answer your question as best as I am able, given my limited experience with the harder difficulties, possibly, with the way Fire Emblem is now a lot more casual friendly, with turn rewinding and casual mode, of course, I could see the merit to there being much higher difficulty levels, or if they actually were to experiment with, for example, better AI, I think that would be pretty interesting, because that would make the game feel genuinely harder, not that they were just deliberately overpowering the enemies. So there might be something to that. I don't know if that would actually be implemented, because I know people were asking for a harder difficulty in Engage DLC, like Three Houses eventually got, but Engage never got that. So honestly, I don't really think IS puts that much thought into these super hard difficulties, like I said earlier, because they feel even less balanced than normal mode, and normal mode is already not balanced. So I'm sorry if that doesn't properly answer your question, but again, unlike basically every other FE-tuber out there, I don't play on Maddening or Lunatic or whatever you want to call it, so I can't really comment on that. Now then, next up is not a question per se, but I did put this poll up on my blog a few weeks ago asking which 2023 release you guys wanted me to talk about the most, unscripted of course. And it turns out that Engage won, although I am pleased to note that a couple of the other options had some votes as well, so it's, I guess, good to see that people like me for more than just Fire Emblem. But Engage it is, and I'm not saying that begrudgingly. I do genuinely enjoy Engage. I think I like it more now than I did when it first came out. It took a while to grow on me as a game, and I think that's down to a combination of factors. Yes, people point out that the story and the characters aren't as dynamic or as nuanced as something like Fates or Three Houses, and I do lump those two together because I know there are many people out there who act like Fates is awful in the story department and Three Houses is, diamond in the rough, but I do think they're closer together than a lot of people are willing to admit. But anyway, yes, Engage is campy and cheesy and very much not that, and I even did several videos where I kind of compared it to Blazing Blade of all things, where it's really not that focused on the war narrative as much as you'd expect for a Fire Emblem, and so that's unusual. But I did really enjoy various gameplay aspects of it, even playing on normal mode. And just, there's just a lot of dynamism to your options between not just classes, but also the emblems you can pick, the, what do they call them? The weapon engraves. And you can just kind of play kind of straightforward, like I tend to do, where I keep characters in their default classes, or you can vary things up a lot. And it's kind of like Fates in that respect for me, especially because also like Fates, it doesn't really have a lot of incentive for 100% completion, which does irritate me, I will be honest. If only the post-game didn't have as much fishing, I would probably like it more, but unfortunately that is by far the best way to get bond fragments. So if you're trying to see all the support conversations and all the bond conversations and all, and I tend to get wrapped up in stuff like that rather than just playing the game over and over again. And so that wore me out over the spring when I was kind of finishing all that up and finishing the DLC and all that. But I think now that it's been, a good 7-8 months since I've really played Engage, and I'm coming back to it now, I'm liking it more. I'm appreciating the nuance that it has in, gameplay styles that, again, even on normal mode, you can, appreciate it. And just kind of the presentation, as someone who has played in some form every single mainline Fire Emblem game, there is a lot of nostalgia bait here, and it's just really straightforward, good fun to see all of these emblem characters. And yeah, maybe not all of them have the greatest characterization compared to their original versions. I know Micaiah is kind of a weird standout in that regard, but it's just cheesy fun, and I enjoy coming back to it, and I may actually do a full playthrough again sometime in the near future. I've been thinking about it. So that's something I really like about Engage, is that it nails the anniversary game feel, which is also good in the sense that I'm not really expecting IS to follow Engage up with another game that's very much like it, even to the extent of, say, how Fates copied a lot of things from Awakening. Just because it is so dependent on, the legacy of Fire Emblem looking backward, that they really can't do that again, except for another anniversary game. And, the next notable anniversary for Fire Emblem would, I guess, be the 40th, which would be in 2030. So we've cut quite a ways off from that. So they'll have to go and do something different, and I'm kind of looking forward to see what their next non-remake game is. I'm just kind of rambling about Engage here because that's what the prompt was about, but this is just kind of where my thoughts are taking me here, and I really do appreciate the character work more the more distance I get from it, and the more supports I actually get to look at, because that's another problem with support conversations in Engage, is that they're pretty slow to build. But the more I've seen them, the more I can enjoy characters like Citrine, Seedall, Diamant to an extent, both of the Pyrenees royals, a couple others here and there they're kind of slipping my mind. Ivy's a standout, even though Ivy is very much a character type I'm not normally into, but she's probably not as high ranking for me as Camilla, because I do actually like a lot of things about Camilla, and no, it's not the obvious thing that people are supposed to like about Camilla. But I think that this cast is fairly solid, and I am enjoying that. I don't know if I would rank the characters above Three Houses collectively, but maybe on individual levels, there's definitely some standouts. Also, too, and this should come as no surprise because I made 2 separate videos about them, I loved the Legacy Paralogue idea. I think Engage does the whole looking back on past maps thing way better than Awakening did, and better than Fates' half-hearted little attempt too. So it was just really nice getting to revisit those big story and map moments from these past games, and I wouldn't mind seeing more of that in the future, even though, I know the whole throwback thing doesn't appeal to everyone, especially if you haven't played all those games, and some of them are fairly obscure, like FE5, for example, and that could be an issue. But, as I said a little bit earlier, I don't think IS could just repeat this premise again, not for quite some time, because it just doesn't work outside of the anniversary context. That is my biggest takeaway on Engage. It's a game that didn't really sell me at first, but it is slowly growing on me. It'll probably make it up into my sort of mid-tier rankings for Fire Emblem, for games that I don't revisit often, but ones that I generally enjoy when I do. Stuff like Path of Radiance, Sacred Stones, games like that. Not the really top-tier ones, the Genealogy, Echoes. Yes, Three Houses. I do really enjoy Three Houses, despite criticisms. But yes, those are my general feelings on Engage, approximately a year out from its release. I highly doubt anyone watching this has not played Engage at this point, but on the off chance that you haven't and you're interested in checking out Fire Emblem, I might not start with Engage just because you would be fairly lost when it comes to all the nostalgic references. But it is a pretty good, it's an easy game to get into, I think, if you can keep an open mind about that. I'd say it kind of handles selling the series a lot better than Heroes does, for example. So yeah, I do think Engage is a little bit in the unfairly maligned category that Fates is in, not to that much of an extreme for a number of reasons. But I do recommend it if, for whatever strange reason, you haven't played Engage, but you are somewhat familiar with Fire Emblem as a franchise. Have you read or watched any version of Legend of the Galactic Heroes? Unfortunately, this is going to be a short answer. I have not. It might surprise people to learn given the content of my channel, but outside of a handful of video game companies, I'm really not familiar with most Japanese media. And this would be one such example. I do appreciate you sharing this, however, and that's why I'm leaving it up on the screen so that people can read what you had to say about Claude and Hubert's inspirations. I do find that quite interesting. But having just looked at a basic synopsis of this a series of novels that became an anime, it's probably not the sort of thing that would appeal to me much, even if I'd heard of it beforehand, not just because it's Japanese, but also because it's sci-fi, and it takes me a lot to get into sci-fi. It's just not my preferred aesthetic. But again, I do appreciate you sharing this with everyone, so that's why I wanted to include it in the video, even though my answer is quite disappointing, I'm sure. Which Fire Emblem character across the whole series is the best parent for skill inheritance? Okay, I see that someone has actually paid attention to my offhand remarks that I really enjoy the so-called breeding meta of the 3 Fire Emblem games that have parents and children. It's kind of a little niche side interest of mine. But the way this is phrased, this is hard. Because if you hadn't said skill inheritance, I could have just given the simple but boring answer of Lewin, because there is just nobody who affects gameplay as heavily as the character who can hand one of, well, realistically two, but technically three characters an S-ranked tome that gives you, I think, like 20 speed and 10 skill or something like that. It's really overpowered, and it's something that absolutely no one else can do, and there's nothing comparable to it. And the only thing close would be Robin in Awakening, because of their class access. They can let their kids can do anything. And I guess that technically feeds into the best skill inheritance question, because skills are pretty much exclusively tied to classes in Awakening. So if Robin is their parent, they can do anything with that. However, if we're speaking specifically about skills, then I think it gets a little harder. I don't think it could be anyone from Genealogy, just because Inheritance and Genealogy is much more of a package deal, where it's not just skills, it's also Holy Blood and inventory, and certain conversations that you unlock if you have certain pairings that get you items. And it's not going to be anyone from Fates either. I didn't even mention Fates earlier because FE14 is way more balanced than the other two. There's no overly centralizing skill there like Pursuit in FE4 or Gale Force in FE13. And parents and kids get just as much, if not more, from things like Heart Seals and Friendship Seals than they do from Inheritance, so Fates isn't even really in this equation. So I believe it's going to come right back to Awakening. I could just say Robin, but again, because I want to at least consider more interesting answers, I can look beyond that a little bit. Bear in mind, too, that when I'm talking about Awakening Inheritance, I'm mostly thinking of Apotheosis meta. I know that there's a completely separate meta for Lunatic and Lunatic Plus, but I'm not as familiar with that one. As I recall, it's a lot about who you pair up and Dark Mages using Nosferatu to tank and things like that. Apotheosis is quite different because you can't really tank. It's a very offensively oriented meta. So I would like to highlight Gaius there, because he has a lot of things that he can do in terms of skill inheritance, to where one thing does overshadow everything else, namely that he gives Gale Force to daughters who don't normally get it because they inherit Pegasus Knight from him. So that's something that really takes priority over everything. But if you're, for whatever reason, not looking into that for Shell or Noir, then he offers Astra for characters who are looking for a second proccing ability after Luna or Ether or something like that. He's got a really good speed cap to inherit, or whatever, the speed growth and the extra cap, whatever it's called. And that's good. He's one of the few fathers who's available for Sumia. She's only got, I think, 5 options, and one is Crom and one is Robin. So her access to fathers is a lot more limited. And so if you want a good Cynthia in a vacuum, Gaius is amazing for that. There's also Henry, who kind of pulls double duty because he passes down Dark Mage, so he's probably good in the Lunatic Plus meta, although based on everything I've heard about Lunatic Plus, the kids don't factor into it much because of just how late you get them in the story and how hard they are to catch up to the other characters. But from the other end, I mean, he's got the Dark Mage option, which is good for the plus hit skills. He's got Berserker. There's a couple of sons who really like having Berserker, like Jerome. I think he single-handedly fixes Jerome because Jerome just doesn't get a lot from his mother. Or, let's see, I think he's like one of the only characters other than Robin who can make a Valkyrie daughter work, because Valkyrie is just weirdly rare as a class, and the other ones that give the Troubadour line, I think Gregor and Donald, they both give negative magic, so that's not great. So he's that. And since I mentioned, characters who basically get everything from their set parent, I want to point out Maribel, because she randomly gives Brady basically everything he could ask for in terms of skills. Just right out the gate, Gale Force, Luna, and then the classes to use them in, though we're not really talking about that, along with a good stat caps for magic, which again, we're not really talking about because skill inheritance. But that's a really rambling answer, but I'm just pointing out that there are a lot of good awakening parents who offer a variety of skills and who are not just Robin. Because, I mean, yes, Robin is the most versatile, and I do believe that Robin is the best, objectively best answer to this question, but I did want to give a bit of a broader perspective on this. Among the TV shows and games that you haven't finished or able to get into, if you could pick one to somehow manage to get through, which would it be? The first thought I had here, and the big stinging upset for me in 2023, would be Tears of the Kingdom. I have never been a big fan of open world games. They tend to overwhelm my completionist tendencies because there's just too much to do and there's not enough direction to it, not enough structure. And while I did play through the entirety of Breath of the Wild back in 2017, it really burned me out on the concept. And even though I've been a Zelda fan for basically my entire life, and I played and enjoyed every mainline Zelda prior to Breath of the Wild, and even got some enjoyment out of that, I just had no hype for Tears of the Kingdom when it was coming out, and I could not bring myself to care, and I ended up not getting it and not playing it, which is the first time I've ever skipped a Zelda game. That's just a really strange feeling that, you know, a series that you really love just went in a direction that you can't follow it. And even though I have spoiled myself on the story and I've watched a bunch of gameplay and just I know so much about it and I've seen so much about it and I've read developer interviews about the direction they want to take the series, and I just cannot get invested in it. It's really sad to me that I can't enjoy open world games to the extent that everyone else seems to be able to, because it's just too much going on for me. I like to have that structure when I play a video game, and I just don't like to be plopped down into this giant world and told, go do whatever you want, because my first impulse would be I have to do everything. But there is no there's no easy way to break it down into chunks. Even something like the very first Legend of Zelda on the NES. Yes, it's technically open world in the same way, but it's such a small world that you can indeed break it up that way, and it's not too difficult. I mean, the combat is hard in that game, but the actual, division of content isn't hard. That's what gets me about open world Zelda, and that's true of open world games in general. When Skyrim came to the Switch a few years ago, someone let me try out their copy for about an hour or so, and I just couldn't get into it. Part of it, that was I just don't enjoy the first person perspective as much, and the third person felt awkward, but it was also just, I knew what was ahead of me, and I already felt like the world was kind of drab and uninviting, and I just didn't have a lot of motivation to keep going because everything was so open and so unfocused. And to highlight another specific example of this, and this one even more than Tears of the Kingdom, is one that really disappoints me as something that I really wish I could get into, but just can't. Also, in this case, I literally could not play it even if I wanted to, because it's not on the Switch, and my PC is not strong enough to run it. But that would be Red Dead Redemption 2. The main reason I would want to play Red Dead Redemption 2 is that the largest city in the game is heavily inspired by New Orleans as it was in the 1890s. Now, if you didn't know, I'm from New Orleans. My family has been here for many generations. This particular city was inspired by how it was back in my great-great and great-great-great-grandparents' day, approximately. So I would really love to see that in an open world environment. I do believe that if I am playing an open world concept, I'd rather it be used in urban spaces like that. I think those are more interesting than these vast wildernesses, but I'm probably in the minority there. Anyway, I would just love to see Saint-Denis, as it's called in the game, and just kind of point out, that was inspired by this is like this, etc., etc. I'm using footage here from another YouTube video that I found of wandering around in the city because I just enjoy watching this so much, and I wish I could experience it for myself. But unfortunately, I can't for a number of reasons, not even counting the hardware limitations. One is that, as I understand it, Saint-Denis is very far into the game. Like, you don't reach the city until, I think, the 4th chapter out of 5. So you'd have to play through a lot of Wild West storyline that I wouldn't be terribly invested in to get there. And the other is the cultural divide, as it were. If you don't know much about the Louisianais, the French-speaking and ethnically French people of Louisiana, a lot of us don't consider ourselves American, and the culture of southern Louisiana is distinctively Latin, European, French, and Spanish, among others. And New Orleans has always prided itself on being not American. And so growing up from that perspective, the idea of playing as these, I think, mostly Anglo-American cowboys who come to essentially New Orleans and are put off by how exotic and foreign it is. And I've seen some of the side quests and little things you can do in the city that just kind of lean into that. I think there's like a guy who dresses in drag there, and of course the main character has to be a little weirded out by that kind of thing. I just don't think I could get in that mindset when, I've spent my entire life looking at it from the other direction. I don't even think I could roleplay that in a video game, especially after 3 chapters of having to do other storylines in settings inspired by the American Wild West, because that just doesn't really appeal to me. So, unfortunately, my appreciation of Saint-Denis as a setting is going to have to remain like this, just watching it through other people playing it on YouTube and enjoying it as much as I can that way. To draw a comparison that also sort of answers the question here, it's a bit like my feelings on Supernatural. If you know anything about me, you know that my home base is on Tumblr, so you would expect me to have watched Supernatural and love it because Destiel is practically keeping the lights on that website and has been for several years. But I could just never get into Supernatural because it's so much of that Americana kind of Wild West, but not really feeling to it. And that just feels foreign and strange to me, but also not terribly interesting. So that's why I never watched Supernatural, despite, it being one of the big 3 that was Tumblr made super popular back then. And to be fair, I didn't really like Sherlock or Doctor Who either. I'm not into a lot of British television, but I'm still not into Supernatural in its latter days now that, we deliver important news events via Destiel memes, etc. I'm aware of it via internet osmosis, but I've never actually watched the show or been able to get into it. Rank the roots of 3 houses and 3 hopes from best to worst. I had to take a step back when I read this one because I feel like I'm at this point so far removed from Fodlan discourse, because I did that big discourse video back in August and September, and I felt like I got everything out that I wanted to say about it, and I felt like I could move on. But here it is again. I did consider just not doing it for the video. However, I think that's kind of sending the wrong message after the discourse video, because I mentioned there that I was so burned out on the Fodlan games in large part because of all the trolling and the harassment that went on in the fandom. And so by me choosing not to cover it, I'm kind of letting those bullies win, aren't I? It's strange. It actually got me thinking more about how I could go back to 3 Houses and 3 Hopes for future content, and in the near future you may actually be seeing some videos to that effect, because yeah, I think there are still things to talk about that aren't just bad things the fandom has done. If you can look past that and just try to stay positive, or just stay on the messages that you want to put out, then I think I could do that. So yes, I'm actually going to go ahead and do this, and I even found a tier list maker on the website there that includes all the roots. They even have White Clouds and Cindered Shadows, which is a little more than I would have expected, but since they're here, I figure I'll go ahead and include them in the ranking as well. So as we watch me play through 3 Hopes, because one thing I can say about 3 Hopes, regardless of any of its other faults, is that it does tend to be more interesting as something to have on in the background than 3 Houses does. It's a much flashier and more dynamic visual. So with that said, let's get into the ranking. I have 3 tiers here. I even specifically chose 3 colors that would not indicate any particular bias as much as possible. And I ordered the routes in the arrangement that you see them in game. So like houses starts with white clouds and then goes forward to silver snow, azure moon, like that. So that seemed like the least biased way of doing organization here, short of alphabetical, of course. With all that said, let's get started with white clouds. White clouds is awkward to talk about independently of the routes that follow it. And there's also the issue that it has an identity crisis of sorts, in that it's really Persona meets Harry Potter that is also theoretically building up to a standard Fire Emblem story. And that is an awkward combination that just does not segue well once you get to Chapter 12 and the time skip. And that in combination with it being quite repetitive from house to house, there's really not a lot of significant changes other than certain dialogue cutscenes, leads White Clouds into feeling, well, not all that remarkable, especially if you play the game a whole bunch, because then you'll be seeing it so many times. It does have a lot of those Harry Potter plot-esque staples, the school life sim stuff. I mean, there's a dance, there's a competition between the houses, there's the teasing of, classes and exams and things like that. But there's also the school mystery, the build-up of this obvious red herring in Rhea, and then at the very end, the mask comes off of the Flame Emperor, and you're like, oh, it was Edelgard the whole time. I never expected her to be the actual villain. And yeah, that plays out by the numbers, and it's okay for what it is. Some of the plotting is a bit sketchy here and there. I think the bigger issue with that part of White Clouds' story is that so much of it is just never addressed again after the mask comes off. And part 2 plods forward as if the Flame Emperor stuff never happened. And you can tell that IS and Koei Tecmo didn't really care about that angle either, because they completely removed it from Three Hopes. Like, even in the prologue, they subtly changed events to where the Flame Emperor just flat out doesn't exist anymore. While White Clouds has issues, it does some things well. Like, I can see why the school life sim stuff would be appealing to some people, and also why that would be the marketable angle that IS continues to push years after Three Houses came out. Like, it's by far the most common source for Heroes alts, and it's also pretty much the only aspect of Three Houses that got represented in Engage, because of how they present the house leaders as emblems, and also how Violet's Paralogue basically has no nods to the actual story of Three Houses, and it's really just, backstory about Sothis and the church, and, they're just 3 school rivals, but, we're not going to lead into a war here, and we don't need to mention the Flame Emperor or anything like that, even though the Paralogue is Chapter 11, which is when Edelgard's plan is exposed. So that is kind of awkward, but that's Engage. That's not Three Houses. So I will put White Clouds in the middle, because, yeah, it's got issues, but there are things about it that I can enjoy. It does get repetitive, but if you've run this game enough, you do eventually learn the sorts of things you can skip out of it. And I confess there is a certain pleasure to be had in sort of building up your units from the ground up, which is something Fire Emblem doesn't typically do, at least not on the scale that Houses did. So there is that aspect of White Clouds that I like. Other things like, is it just riffing off of Grail and his death, or Zelgius with the Death Knight? Those are more larger referential things that I can't hold against White Clouds exclusively, so I'm not going to. Next, we're getting into the 4 proper routes of Three Houses. Because White Clouds has listed as its own separate thing here, though, I can only really talk about these from the perspective of Chapter 13 onward, so be sure to keep that in mind. I've said this before, but Silver Snow is really the rough draft of Three Houses. You can clearly see that it's where the developers came up with the original concept of an avatar fighting a lord, which the more I think about it, they've kind of done before with Robin getting possessed by Grima, or with Corrin being forced to fight their family. But here they really committed to that idea, and that's what Silver Snow is. Unfortunately, they then had other ideas that they fleshed out in other routes that they didn't go back and put or properly integrate into Silver Snow, which is one of several reasons that it ends up being overlooked so often. The most obvious one being the Gronder Field rematch, because it still happens in the story, it just happens off screen, and the calendar even completely skips over the month that it occurs in. So you really feel that one missing chapter. The other obvious standout of Silver Snow being a first draft is that it doesn't have a proper final boss. After you get back from Shambhala, you're basically in a playable epilogue at the same position you were in, that you be in Verdant Wind, except here there's no nemesis. And so it's kind of like, oh, you're going to take over as the Archbishop because Rhea is dying, and that's what it feels like. And then at the very 11th hour, Rhea suddenly develops Dragon Madness based on this obscure piece of lore that's only previously mentioned by like one NPC in Chapter 2 or something like that. And it's like, oh, well, here's your final boss. And while that is very good for people who enjoy difficulty, because Silver Snow has by far the hardest endgame of the 4 routes, it's something you even feel on normal mode, if you're looking for good story, it just doesn't work. And it's just so obvious that they were struggling to think of a way to end it that wasn't just copying Verdant Wind, I guess. That leaves Silver Snow's only real unique selling point as Rhea's S ranks. And if you don't want to marry the Dragon MILF Pope, I guess you're just not going to get a lot out of this route. There are small moments that the other routes don't offer, having to do with Ferdinand and Sedeth, but then that all comes back to the other big problem of Silver Snow, which is that Byleth absolutely cannot carry a route on their own. They are such a non-entity as a character that you have fans casting around for, who's the actual Lord of Silver Snow? Is it Sedeth? Is it Ferdinand? Is it Rhea somehow, even though she's barely in it? It would have been much better, admittedly, I think a lot of people agree that it would have been better if Rhea could have come back at the start and actually been the main character and been playable, but we didn't get that. So instead, you just have this very empty power fantasy with the vacuum that is Byleth's non-presence at the center of it. And it just feels like both Verdant Wind and Azure Moon, with all of the interesting bits from either of those, cut off, and there's really not much to appeal to players in Silver Snow unless you're just looking for difficulty, which is why I'm putting it down in the has problems tier. Azure Moon, on the other hand, is the one route of Three Houses that feels like it really understood the assignment of actually being a Fire Emblem story, because it is by far the most traditional narrative in the game, and therefore it's the one that hangs together the best without glaring plot holes or awkward pacing or just weird use of exposition dumps and things like that. Because if you took out White Clouds, if we talked about things, Azure Moon only from Chapter 13 forward until the end, it could pass for something like FE5 or something where you have a lord at a low point who needs to be brought out of it by the people around them and eventually takes on the invading force that is threatening his territory. And that's basically what Azure Moon is. It's, the Blue Lord against the Red Emperor. And it cuts out so many of the things about White Clouds that were not developed properly and that don't really work because they're not developed. The things like the Agarthans as a threatening presence, they really don't work, and you see with both Verdant Wind and Silver Snow that there's awkward falling action of dealing with them, which feels tangential to the whole Continental War angle. Or even Rhea. I think Rhea has potential as a character, but she's severely underutilized in both of the Fogland games, and I don't really feel her absence in Azure Moon, that she's just flat out gone from the story. Dimitri basically carries Azure Moon with his story arc and with the love and support of the people around him. Now, I prefer that the self-insert were not so much involved in that, but the good news is that Azure Moon is also the route where Byleth is least necessary to the story. You could take them out and the story would work basically fine on their own with Dimitri's established support network standing in. for the emotional scenes and for the development that he needs to get. You can see this with Azure Gleam, which we'll talk about a bit later. But that's another big draw, at least for me personally, because I never bought into the self-insert fantasy, that Byleth is not really necessary for the story to work. Azure Moon is also one of only 2 routes in Houses that I think understands how to do a proper climax, because it doesn't have that falling action that I was talking about with Silver Snow and Verdant Wind. You know, you get this actual big confrontation with Edelgard at the end, and because you get back and forth between Dimitri and Edelgard, Dimitri, unlike Byleth, is a proper character, it feels more solid and more fitting as a basis than the Byleth versus Edelgard stuff from Silver Snow. And then when you compound this with how Azure Moon is the most varied of the non-Crimson Flower routes, with, I believe it's got 2 chapters that are entirely unique to it, and then it also does a bit more with the Enbar map and the Enbar Palace map, because they're endgame chapters instead of like 2/3 of the way through chapters, as it were. That's a good thing. I do like the gameplay and story integration of Dimitri being temporarily unavailable for the monastery stuff. It feels almost like the game is winking at how dumb keeping up the, you know, the school life sim stuff during a war actually is, by having a character who is severely affected by his trauma not participating in the school stuff, at least temporarily. So I do appreciate that, and from the perspective at least of 100% completionist, it doesn't really affect gameplay all that much. I do wish that Azure Moon hadn't sidelined to do the way that it did. I'm not saying that the route is perfect, by the way, but that is probably my biggest complaint. That and Byleth continuing to have a presence are my biggest issues with Azure Moon. And honestly, if they were both fixed, it would be very close to perfect as far as a shorter Fire Emblem story goes, but it would also be a lot gayer than IS would ever write, so I can kind of see why they didn't go with that angle. I mean, between Dedue and Felix. And we see more of that in Three Hopes, so we're gonna get there, but unsurprisingly, I'm putting Azure Moon in my personal favorites. The lazy way to go about ranking Verdant Wind would just be to say that it's so much a copy and paste of Silver Snow that it can't really be appreciated as its own route. However, I do think that Claude, and to a lesser extent the rest of the Deer, add enough of a distinction that I can appreciate its merits somewhat. However, it is indeed not distinct enough from Silver Snow for me to rank it much higher. So I think its biggest problem is just that they ran into either time issues or budget issues, and they couldn't properly flesh it out and especially develop Claude in a way that feels impactful compared to how the other house leaders are developed, because so much of what goes on with him, whether it's the work in the Alliance Council or the stuff he does in Elmira or with the other Elmiran characters, it all happens off screen, and you don't really get to appreciate him because of that. You have to sort of fill in the mystery yourself, which, you know, if you're so inclined to do that, go right ahead. But there's not a lot there that motivates me to put in that extra effort. I mean, there are reasons that I've talked about previously, somewhat shallow, mostly to do with the lack of gay subtext, that disincline me to putting in that additional work for Claude. The Nemesis battle is at least entirely unique, and it's got a interesting gimmick that calls back to Genealogy's endgame. I mean, that's kind of nice. There's really not terribly much, though, that makes Verdant Wind stand out from Silver Snow, aside from it does have the Gronder Field rematch, and again, the Nemesis thing. That's why I can't rank it very high, and also, as I said before, about the whole thing with Rhea being this very late-game exposition dump, it just feels super awkward. And having the story and, you know, continue on for 2 chapters after you've defeated Edelgard and after they've reused a cutscene from Silver Snow, like Claude's not even in her execution scene, which is just lazy. You know, Shambhala and Talas are just not interesting enough. At most, they survive on spectacle, you know, then the threat of nukes and all, but that's, you know, it feels like rushed, sloppy storytelling to try to build them up as, like, the bigger, almost post-game threat that they're apparently meant to be, when Edelgard's been the one driving the plot the whole time. But, you know, we've got EDM mole men with nukes, and they also have zombies in their basement. So that's Verdant Wind. And whatever development might have gone on in Claude's arc, half of it's off screen, so there's not much to enjoy. I'm putting it above Silver Snow, but it's not going any higher than that. The individuals who've trolled me over the years are very likely under the impression that I hate Crimson Flower and that it's bottom tier for me, following the logic that if you like Azure Moon, you must hate Crimson Flower, and vice versa. And the great irony is that that's not true. There are things that I genuinely enjoy about Crimson Flower. Like, I love Hubert in basically every aspect. He's hammy and evil, and he's just perfect for what he is. And I do like the tone whenever he's on screen. It's a lot more in keeping with what I would expect of a route like this. I love the Dimmy-Doo death scene that actually makes one chapter easier if you can manage to get it, and it's so beautiful and heartfelt and unexpected. It's like, I really did not think the writers would insert something like that, but they did, and it's gorgeous. I like some of the different perspectives on character development that we get in Crimson Flower because of how drastically different the circumstances are. Felix is a real standout there, as is Ferdinand, although that partially ties back into Ferdibert and therefore Hubert. And on the other hand, some of the things I dislike about Crimson Flower are admittedly petty. Like, for example, I dislike greatly the way that Yuritsa was implemented as a Gota unit, because that is just such a pain to deal with from an 100% completion perspective. And he makes what is already the shortest and therefore least resource valuable route even worse, and makes Edelgard and Hubert worse by proxy because they're locked to it. So I know, though, that that is fairly petty. I do like that even though it's clearly a short and rushed route, that Crimson Flower has more unique maps and a completely different story direction. The changes that had to be made to the story overall to make it work sometimes don't make a lot of sense. Like, for example, you basically have to headcanon why the Empire would not have done what it did with Cornelia, where it took over half of Fargus during the time skip. I mean, the meta reason is that they didn't want the Empire to feel completely overpowered, but I'm not sure they handled that well anyway, because, you know, as soon as you get back, Edelgard's like, oh, let's go conquer another country, and you do it in 2 chapters. That's pretty hit or miss. As I mentioned before, I do not like how it's written to be a romance for the self-insert with Edelgard, half because, you know, I'm not into Edelgard in any sense, and half because it gives the route serious tone problems at times. Like, Edelgard will watch somebody die in front of her, and then a couple of scenes later, she's blushing because Byleth caught her drawing a picture of them. And then she spends a chapter holed up in her room like Bernadetta because, oh, you know, my teacher can't see that I have a crush on them. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. This is supposed to be a war story, and no other character is treated that way. You can tell, even when they're trying to build emotional moments between Byleth and Dimitri or Claude, they never get silly stuff like that, and it's so obvious, and I just cannot get into it at all. So that's something that's dragging Crimson Flower down, but like I said, it's got good points, and I appreciate them, at least when Yuritsa is not driving me insane. So I am putting Crimson Flower in the middle category because it does have some good points. Behind White Clouds, though, I think White Clouds hangs together better as whatever it's supposed to be, whereas Crimson Flower, the tone issues and the pacing, they're rough. You can tell that it was a later edition. Moving on to Cindered Shadows now. Cindered Shadow's story doesn't actually stick with me all that much. It's kind of like completely its own thing, but also sort of cribbing lore from Silver Snow, which again is another reason for Silver Snow to not be that important in the grand scheme of things. But the Ashen Wolves are fine. Cindered Shadows is also technically longer than Crimson Flower. It's 7 chapters compared to 6, which is funny when you think about it. And it offers a unique gameplay challenge that you're not going to get anywhere else in Three Houses, so that does allow the DLC to stand out a bit more than it might otherwise. The story itself is kind of hit or miss, but I like Cindered Shadows for what it is. I'm going to end up putting it above Crimson Flower, but below White Clouds, kind of a recognition of it being good for what it is, but being fairly bite-sized even so. It does help that the wolves are all quite likable characters. Probably could have done with a more interesting villain than what we got. Like, I can barely remember Elfric's name half the time, but it's there. And also, for what it's worth, Cindered Shadows gives us, I think, the only named mother with a portrait in all of Three Houses, which is incredibly sad. But hey, Citri is posthumously in the game, so that's cool, I guess. And now we move on to the Three Hopes routes. Scarlet Blaze fixes many of the issues that I had with Crimson Flower. It's the same length as all the other routes, so the pacing is not as rushed. There's no romance angle, really, with the self-insert, so that's not causing serious tone issues. And aside from that, Edelgard generally has a lot more agency in Scarlet Blaze than she does in Crimson Flower, which is really refreshing to see even from the beginning. And it's not just fighting back against the Agarthans, it's her doing more of the actual work herself, putting more of the thought into the strategy. It's not like Crimson Flower, you come away with the impression that Hubert was behind most of it, like he did most of the actual planning, both in White Clouds and later on in Crimson Flower. But Edelgard pushes back against him from the very beginning, and that's really refreshing to see. There's also that one scene I'm thinking of about halfway in Scarlet Blaze where Edelgard actually acknowledges that she made a mistake by trying to fight a war on two fronts at the same time, with her army just kind of switching back and forth between them. It's like, yeah, that's a pretty dumb way to wage a war, and she actually does something to fix that. She makes an alliance with Claude, so yeah, Edelgard's character is generally quite a bit better here because she's not tied down so much to having to be a love interest first and foremost. However, then you get to the ending, and Scarlet Blaze just really drops the ball on its ending for two main reasons. One is that it does unnaturally shove Byleth back into the story. This is the only one of the Three Hopes routes that is significantly altered if you recruit Byleth, and it just feels absolutely ridiculous. Like, Claude decides to stay with the Empire or not based on whether or not you recruit Byleth, and there's no connection there. Byleth has a bit more of a personality in Three Hopes, but their story has almost nothing to do with the war. It's all tied into Shez's arc, which is completely disconnected from the main story. You can see this in the way that the Arval interlude, as I call it, is handled. Like, it's just kind of shoved in there right before Endgame if you got it, and it has no connection to what comes before or what comes after, so it's the same either way, and that's particularly noticeable in Azure Gleam, where Edelgard is brainwashed, and then she's not brainwashed, and then she's brainwashed again. So yes, that's the problem with Scarlet Blaze's ending. The other one is that the very last scene contrives the scenario where Edelgard doesn't get to kill either of her main enemies. They destroy each other, and she just watches them do it. It's just one last refusal to give her any proper agency, presumably because they wanted to go for the cutesy high five thing she does with Shez instead, and it's just, you really dropped the ball there. I am going to put Scarlet Blaze above Crimson Flower, but only just above because of those problems I had with it. I will say that Crimson Flower does still have a few standout things, like, for example, it does more with Hubert, and I like Hubert. I don't care for his diminished presence in Scarlet Blaze, but I kind of understand why it was done. I mean, I could do without the back and forth between him and Monica, because it's basically one long joke at Monica's expense, and that's just really a shame. But I am putting Scarlet Blaze just above Crimson Flower. It's not going any higher because it does have issues, but I like parts of it. The weird thing, too, about Scarlet Blaze, before I move on, is that it's the Three Hopes route that is talked about the least by far, which I find a little unusual because Crimson Flower is so controversial. But you have Gold and Wildfire being talked about a lot because people are divided on what it does with Claude's character, and then Azure Gleam appeals to people who don't like Three Hopes in general because it's still fairly solid and also pretty shippy if you're into certain pairings. And there's also the whole thing with what happens to Edelgard and Azure Gleam, but Scarlet Blaze is just kind of there, and I do think that's kind of funny. It's almost like the one thing it inherited from Silver Snow is that it's the route that everyone overlooks. But yeah, so let's actually move on now to Azure Gleam. As mentioned, Azure Gleam is quite shippy in ways that I tend to enjoy. I mean, there's a lot of Dimitri with his closest support network, Dedue and Felix, and it fulfills what I wanted to see out of Azure Moon. It's a story with Dimitri's development not leaning on a self-insert. Instead, established characters fill that role for him. And that's really refreshing to see, and I like that. Because it is still kind of more of a traditional Fire Emblem story, or as traditional as you can get in a Warriors spin-off, it does work on that level, although it does have the issue, as I kind of alluded to just a bit ago, that what happens to Edelgard causes lots of weird issues, like it's just kind of gross what it does to her character, and especially when you look at it's from certain angles, and the writers clearly had some fetishes in there, like infantilization, and, you know, she's just put under the thrall of these two older men, and you can tell that there was, like, an element of that there. It's also annoying from a narrative perspective because it is a way for Edelgard to avoid having any agency for starting a war. Azure Moon didn't do that. Azure Moon was willing to make her ugly and monstrous in the form of the Hegemon, whereas Azure Gleam will only tease that, but not actually show it. So again, like Scarlet Blaze's ending, it feels kind of like a cop-out because they didn't want to make Edelgard even slightly less marketable, which is just really disappointing for her, because you want to see more out of characters than just have them be commodities to be sold to us in a mobile gacha, but that's what we got. And that in combination with the brainwashing thing and the Arval interlude that I mentioned, and just... It's a route that gets tougher to appreciate near the end, but if you focus on Dimitri's development and the cute moments with Dedue and Felix, it goes down a lot easier. There is also kind of the minor thing that Azure Gleam is technically the roughest of the Hope's routes from a gameplay perspective, at least from a 100% perspective, because there's so many route-locked characters, and Catherine at least comes super late, and then there's a few others that have smaller availability issues. But because of the way Hopes is structured, that's not as big a deal as it is with Crimson Flower and Yuritsa. I didn't mention that either, but that's another thing Scarlet Blaze has over Crimson Flower, is that there's no Gota character there. I mean, technically Leonie comes super late in Scarlet Blaze, but she's available from the start in Golden Wildfire, so that's no big deal. So, where to put Azure Gleam? It's going in personal favorites, but it's not going to go above Azure Moon. I prefer Azure Moon and Three Houses in general having definitive endings, something that Hopes desperately lacks because they didn't want to step on the toes of the self-insert fantasy with Byleth, and I find that quite irritating. In spite of the overall shippier moments of Azure Gleam and the lack of Byleth really being a presence there. In fact, Azure Gleam is the route where Byleth has the least amount of availability, which is frustrating from a 100% perspective, but it is kind of funny to think about if you don't particularly like them. So that's nice, and I think Azure Gleam does deserve to be up there, but it's not topping Azure Moon. And of course, from the way I'm talking about that, it won't surprise you to learn that I'm not putting Golden Wildfire in my personal favorites. This one is pretty rough. Like, there are some good ideas in Golden Wildfire, but they're never explored as much as you want them to. Like, at the very beginning, they tease Claude's conflict with his brother, but that matters for exactly 2 chapters, and then it's over. You also have the massive change compared to the other routes of Claude taking over the aristocratic oligarchy of the Alliance and turning it into a monarchy under him. That's fairly interesting. It's the biggest political shift in the games, period. I would say even bigger than anything we actually see Edelgard do on screen. But not really much is done with that, because after that it basically becomes a light version of Scarlet Blaze. There's even this weird Agarthan interlude that it shares with Scarlet Blaze. And it's just disappointing because there's a lot of good ideas, but none of them really cohere with each other. Like, where they suddenly pivot to making Rhea the main villain when I think she's in like 3 cutscenes in Golden Wildfire before she becomes a boss. So she's not developed at all. And I mean, Crimson Flower had issues with not developing Rhea properly as an antagonist, but they put in a little more effort there. With Golden Wildfire, it's like you basically have had to rely on these characters telling us that she's this horrible person, or coming from three houses and knowing what Edelgard believes about the church, and that's just your motivation for why we have Rhea as the final boss. It's not quite as out of left field as Silver Snow's final boss is, but oof. And I'm kind of indifferent to Claude. Like, I've never really been a big fan, but I also don't really dislike him. Golden Wildfire, from the beginning, when we got the demo, which was like the first 3 chapters, it set up the idea that Claude's story would be completely different from the war going on in the other 2 routes, because it made his conflict about Shahid. So we thought it would be about Almyra and about that angle, Almyra versus the Alliance and that kind of thing, and Claude having to, choose between them. And that's really interesting. I think that's what Claude fans really wanted to see from him all along, is just not be an accessory in the Edelgard versus Dimitri war. And yet, Golden Wildfire just turns around and does exactly that once it's done with Shahid. It just turns Claude into an accessory in the Edelgard versus Dimitri war, just puts him on the other side. So, while I like the alliance from Scarlet Blaze's angle, in Golden Wildfire, it just diminishes the impact of what they could have done with Claude, and it's not really made up for by Claude doing the haha, I might betray you at any point kind of thing, because it's not going to happen before the credits roll, and the credits roll right after Rhea dies, and then there's another text crawl that's like, the war's not over, but we're not invested enough to actually, finish this story, so, watch the credits. From the sound of how I'm talking about it, you probably think I have this great personal dislike of Golden Wildfire. I don't. I'm disappointed by it. It could have been so much more. It could have gotten me to really be invested in Claude as a character after Verdant Wind mostly did a copy-paste job that didn't really do him justice either, but that's what we got. I'm not putting it below Silver Snow because it does have some merits, including from a gameplay perspective. Three Hopes generally has more dynamic gameplay, and I like that how Three Hopes handles recruitment. That's just generally better than Houses. And because Golden Wildfire has fewer playable units than the other 2 routes, there are certain advantages to that. But it is going below Verdant Wind in the lowest tier. So, between Silver Snow and Verdant Wind. So, after all that, I finally finished this tier list, and with it, that last question that I had. That one took a lot longer than the others, but I guess making an entire tier list will tend to do that. Thank you all so much for watching, and for joining me for another year of YouTube shenanigans. I've really enjoyed watching this channel grow. I passed 500 subscribers this year, and I got to put out my big Discourse video on account of that. And now that that's out of the way, like I said a while back, I may be doing some more Fire Emblem, like shorter Fire Emblem essay videos, things that have kind of been in the back of my mind a lot, and I want to get out there in video form. You can look forward to some of those in the coming months. So if you watch this video and for some reason you're not subscribed to my channel, go ahead and subscribe because you don't want to miss those. I've got one planned for January and another for February. Be sure to like the video too if you enjoyed listening to me ramble. I like making these. They're a lot of fun, and they're not quite as much work as my big scripted videos. So again, thank you. Thank you especially to my patrons who really help me, with ideas and with support for the channel. And I couldn't do it without you guys. If you'd like to help out the channel, go check out my Patreon. There's a link down below. But that's going to do it for me. Happy New Year, everyone, and I will see you later. Au revoir.